All right, so today I'm doing my first, what I'm going to call whiteboard talks. I was going to do these on a whiteboard, and then I realized how bad my handwriting is. So we're going to do them through a PowerPoint, but it's just about getting the information out there. And really, it's a big part of this is talking through my own thoughts. I think like the biggest way you can learn from something is having a conversation, like an internal conversation about it, to learn what your really thoughts are and like move and progress yourself with your ideas. But today we're going to talk about resisted sprints in training. One of the things I've gotten the most gains out of with all my athletes, including myself. I think it's a big part of anybody's training for any more advanced athlete, which we'll get into. But they're great for developing speed and acceleration specifically. And I think everybody should use them in their training at some point in time. Now, you can't just jump straight into resisted sprints. So I have some speed training prerequisites. You should be able to do these. You should be able to do them over time, well, with good technique. And I'll get into it as kind of I go through these. But the biggest thing is to start building volume over time. You can't jump right into these intense training. You have to do smaller things first, work up to the bigger things, and just build volume in these smaller things first and kind of build your base out, where then you can kind of go up to more advanced methods for as we built that base already. But for the base, we start off with skips for speed. This is something I do with all my athletes. Skips for height. These are great for getting those quick ground contact times when you're bouncing off the ground. That kind of elastic movement is huge for all athletes. Doing it for speed teaches you to push yourself forward. Doing it for height is being able to propel force into the ground, similar to single leg jumps, which is a very hard thing to learn, which I think is another reason why skips are great. It can kind of help athletes learn how to jump off one leg, which is something I struggle with because I didn't do it when I was younger because I thought I was just a good 2-foot jumper. You need to jump off 1 foot, and developing it as young as possible is the best way to do that. Bounds for distance and single leg bounds are huge. Bounds, I'll get into. I made another video about this that I haven't put up yet, but a big thing with bounds is projecting yourself out and understanding that horizontal force and being able to accelerate yourself and cover distance while striking back underneath you with your foot. Single leg bounds is just a more something I would use more for elastic athletes. I really don't use this in my own training because I always get shin splints when I do them. Um, but single leg bounds are great for kind of that piston action, that cyclic motion of sprinting and learning to rebound that 1 foot over and over and over again can be great for elastic athletes that do great with plyometrics. Straight leg bounds are great for getting into the higher speed stuff, but just another basic sprint plyo that I like to use in my training because it's just essential to build your base using all these different things. And then of course, max velocity sprinting. I don't care what weight you can put on a sled and move over a distance if we don't know how fast you're going. If you haven't sprinted at your top velocity time and time again and gotten faster time and time again. I would set like a minimum speed for most people. But everybody's a little bit different, especially between female and male athletes. That's a different kind of criteria I'd be looking at. But if I was saying for most guys, if I had to give you like a limit or something to shoot for before you should start doing anything with sleds, I would say around the 17 mile per hour range, maybe 16.5. For female athletes, probably in the 15 to 16 per mile per hour range. And now strength training prerequisites. We kind of talked about the plyos and like kind of basic. That's just all basic sprints, like work that I do in my training early on with athletes to kind of get a base going. Well, you also need to have strength. A big part of even pulling a sled is being able to create the force to pull it at high speeds and get yourself to still accelerate. So if you're weak as piss, then we're just wasting our time. It's going to look ugly. It's going to feel like crap, and we're not getting any gains out of it. We're just wasting time, probably hurting our athlete more than we're helping them. So for strength training, I always would do probably at least a year of basic strength training, which as I was doing with all the plyos, I was probably do that over a year's time, cycling some of those in and out of our training, just to kind of build up that volume and capacity. I would have at least a body weight deep squat, so full range of motion, butt to the ground, and some athletes, like, this is different, but I'll always just put um, a squat wedge underneath their heels so we can get that up. If ankle mobility is our resisting factor, which most people it is, even in myself, I mean, you just don't have a lot of people that can deep squat good amount of weight with no heel elevation. Like, that's just kind of rare. But a body weight deep squat, so I mean, I'm 200 pounds, so if I can 200-pound deep squat, that's a pretty good example that we're good enough to create enough force to be able to do these sleds and produce enough force to get moving at high speeds, because the sleds don't work if you can't move them fast. That's the whole point. Transverse plane coordination, this is a huge part of sprinting. Sprinting is not linear. I've talked about this many times in my videos. There's actually a lot of rotational movements happening in the body, at the hips, at the knee, all these different joints, where even in like your early acceleration especially, you're going to be rotating a lot to take tension out of your tendons in your legs so that you can just fire off the ground quickly. So doing a lot of things like anti-rotation core work. I mean, this is also because you have to hold this sled on your shoulders. So if we're weak on our core and we're swinging our shoulders back and forth, that's just not what we want. That's not going to help our sprint technique, and we don't want to hurt our technique because we're doing resisted sprints. Variety of med ball throws, just different concentric power movements. I would just do throws against the wall. That's kind of the most basic one that I can think of at the moment. And, any other foundational rotation movements. I would do a lot of things kind of like catching, more of an eccentric motion in this rotational, being able to absorb the force in a rotational plane, in the transverse plane. Once again, it'd probably be something throwing a med ball, catching a med ball in a rotational movement, or some kind of transverse plyo where we have to get back off the ground, absorb the force, and move again. That's that directly applies to sprinting, obviously. Then you have frontal plane coordination. Like I said, sprinting is not just linear. There's so many other movements going on in the body. Just things like lateral lunges, lateral bounce, get a good base. Once again, we're doing this for a year, so I always have frontal plane movements. Not every day in my training, but I try to be pretty close, especially, and same thing with the transverse plane. So lateral bounds, lateral lunges are great ways to do this. That's kind of the strength side, and one of them's more the, what am I trying to say? Stretch shortening cycle, SSC, what you're getting out of those plyos. And then lots of loaded hinges. I mean, you need a strong posterior chain, which is developed in those hinging motions. I'm not just saying RDLs and hamstring curls for, bodybuilders out there. A lot of different deadlifts, WEC 45 method deadlift. We can do a sumo deadlift. We can do a conventional deadlift. We can do single leg Romanian deadlift. I mean, there's just a million different ways to load hinges. And you need to be very efficient in that movement pattern before you even think about starting to do resisted sprints. Excuse me. Sleds versus barbells. The next thing we're getting into here. I think novice athletes, the biggest thing is to master these barbell movements. I mean, if we're sprinting, we're doing our plyos early, and we are getting stronger, you're going to have speed gains. There's no real reason to bring in a more advanced technique, a more advanced method, I should say, if you don't need it. If you're making gains doing what you're doing, why are we going to advance you? We're going to take the gains that we're getting right now, and then once we start to struggle and plateau, then we'll move to that. This doesn't mean that if we get 3 months in and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not a million miles per hour faster, I need to do resisted sprints. No, you need to keep going with this. We'll change up the methods. I mean, you're going to be up and down no matter what you're doing. The whole point is not to just go like this, but it's going to be kind of like a wave, but slowly going up over time. But once we get to those more intermediate and advanced athletes, I really only use sleds to replace barbell training with more advanced people. Like myself, I was someone who's very strong, but could not move quickly, could not apply force quickly. So I use sleds a ton in my training because I'm still working those longer ground contact times, which are better for me to produce force. But I also get that kind of, it's still quicker, way more applicable than anything I would do in the weight room, where you could use those in turn and you wouldn't really do much barbell training. It wouldn't be your focus. The reason sleds are so much better than barbell training is because they're resisting you in the horizontal plane, which is really impossible in any lift other than like an isometric if you're going into like a squat rack. Everything else is kind of, in the sagittal plane mostly. Obviously, we have the transverse stuff, but nothing's really resisting you horizontally unless you're using bands or things of that such around your hips and stuff like that. So having that pull from the horizontal, like a horizontal motion, and that's where your resistance is coming from, is essential, and that's really what makes a big difference with these resisted sprints. And as I was saying before, it's way more specific because we're doing single leg. I mean, that's a huge part. Like producing that much force with one leg really doesn't happen a lot other than in sprinting. Add that resistance into it and you're producing even more force, which is going to slow down your ground contact time, but you're still moving quickly, or at least you should be if you're using the right weight for you. So we still have a good ability to transition between those. Like, we're going a little bit slower with our ground contact times than if we're just doing unresisted sprints, but we're still moving off the ground quickly, rapidly, and getting those steps in. So in terms of that short time to produce that force, it directly applies to sprinting, while we still get more force than just the normal sprint. How to use them. This is a key part. If you don't know what you're doing to use optimal loads, then you're not gonna get a whole lot out of resisted sprints here. I mean, it's just not gonna do a ton for you. So a big part is the optimal weight. So 69 to 96% is like the exact number is optimal. Obviously, we don't just do 100% of what's optimal because you can't jump right into it, and I'll get into that in a moment. So for the sake of this, we're going to say 70% to 90% or 100%. I do a lot of 100% sprints with more advanced athletes like myself. And I use it for like 10 to 30 yards. I mean, this isn't something I like to use in max velocity because if we want to train max velocity, we're going to run as fast as we can. I mean, acceleration is technically 0 to 60 yards. But once we're getting to like that 50 mark, you have to be pretty freaking fast to not hit your top speed until past 30 yards. So like I like to use the 10 to 30 yards. That's usually good for most athletes that I have. If you had somebody that's elite, like that's running like 24 miles per hour, they might be able to go to 40 yards. They're probably still accelerating. They're probably not hitting their top speed quite yet at that time, just because they have such a high speed to get up to. It's great to time these sprints. This is probably a better way to apply it rather than just using body weight. So if I have my laser and I can tell based off how slow our time is going, I can kind of base it not just off body weight, but also your ability to apply force. This is going to kind of take all these other factors into account. Like if you're having just like a slower day, your nervous system's not firing as fast, we'll drop the weight a little bit. That way we can still get the time and like the actual application we're looking for that day. Where if you're just using the loads, if you're just using it based off body weight, it doesn't factor everything else in. It's kind of a baseline. But when we do time it, we can gauge it for different levels of athletes based on how much is this slowing you down. You should never really go past 50% slower than whatever distance you're normally going. And of course, you have to know what your time would be in 10 yards, 30 yards to be able to know that. So you would have to have that before you're doing that training. And then these should be the focus of the training day when they're being used. Put them first in your training. I mean, if I was doing flying 10s, which I really don't put flies and resisted sprint. I mean, sometimes I have, but yeah, it would be a pretty high intensity day. Um, so anyways, the point I was getting at is, put your faster things first, the things that are going to be affected by everything else. So if you're doing resisted sprints and that's your main focus for the day, that's our main thing, we're going to put it first in our training. That's how it always should be. If we're squatting later in the day, that's going to make us slower. If we're doing a bunch of plyometrics, that's going to kind of tax our nervous system. And we want to put in this. This should be the most advanced technique you're using really in the training day, except in like very outlandish scenarios. So put it first in your training. I mean, you just want it to be as optimal as possible for that day. And now, what do they actually do? I mean, you have a lot of physiological developments, but specifically for sprinting, you have a better forward trunk angle. So a lot of people like to pop up in their sprints and acceleration. We really need to be going forward like this. We're going to slowly go up, but we need to be pushing out. It's all horizontal force at the start. We're driving behind us with our legs. This is going to help us get into that angle where you can really lean into that weight, and that's going to kind of hold you up so you can really kind of just let yourself be forward and push off in that horizontal direction. It's going to drop your shin angle. So what that means is when your foot hits the ground originally, we're looking at the shin angle. You want it to be very low, lower than anything else, or lower than any other time in the sprint is going to be at the very start. So once your foot hits the ground, your shin angle is going to drop slightly. That allows you to project out more horizontally once again. Obviously, if your shin is vertical, you're producing more vertical force. You know what I'm saying? So, for example, if you were jumping, once you get into that jump, your shins are going to be vertical when you're at the bottom. Or when you're squatting, your shins are vertical. But once you're sprinting out, your shin angle is going to drop once your foot hits the ground, get even lower so you can project out a little bit more. That makes a big difference, even though it seems like something very small. And works on the physiological developments we talked about. I mean, just the nervous system learning to fire more force. You're on the ground for longer because you're trying to pull this. So you're just going to activate more motor units in that time, and you're going to be able to activate them quicker at the same time is the idea. You should get better at it over time. I mean, that's the thought process of using this, is that your body's going to recruit more motor units when you're on the ground. They're going to learn to fire better at the same time because you're pulling more weight than you're used to. And once you're applying this into your programming, start with very, very, very low volume when first introducing them. Like I said, when you're actually using sleds, they should be the focus of your training. They should not start out as a focus. It should start off vertical integration. So it's going to be a very small, small, small part. And you're just going to kind of get used to it as an athlete, get used to using the sled, how it feels. And we're going to start below optimal loads and still being at a short distance. It's not like we're going to start with a low load and be sprinting 50 yards day one. We might do like low loads and be sprinting 50 yards at some point to build up that volume at the beginning. Like I said, build capacity with distance. And that doesn't mean we have to go super far. It can mean we have a certain amount of sets. It's total yardage in the workout that we're really looking for with that capacity. And we really want to build that up because once we start raising our intensity, the distance is going to go down. But because that intensity is so high, if we don't have a large capacity already built up, it's going to hurt us more than it's going to help us. We're not going to get the gains that we're looking for out of this just because your body's not used to it. Your body can't recover fast enough. It's going to tax your nervous system too much. It's just not what we're looking for. Not a good situation to get yourself into. And now once we actually start using it to have physiological developments, nervous system developments, I shouldn't say physiological, but I like to say that because it's not just like for speed technique. It's really firing in your nervous system. You're not gonna, I mean, you could get slightly hypertrophied from this, but that's not what we're going for. It's going to be more of a nervous system development. And while you shorten the distance, you're going to add some weight on and keep going for those optimal loads in developing that training with your resisted sprints. Working up to those optimal loads or that 50% reduction in speed, just like we talked about. So for an example here, in my program, I feel like this is a much better way to explain it. As I said, I would typically start lighter than optimal load. Say we start at 50%. I still think that's kind of high if I'm just introducing somebody. But let's say it's an intermediate athlete that I've been training for 2, 3, 4 years, whatever it may be, and they're just getting sleds back into their training in this training cycle that they're in for the year. Then, we'll start at something like 50%. We'll do something like 3x30, 4x30. I don't like the 3x40, but I would probably do something like 4x40, maybe even 4x50, and really kind of build that base. And that's 4 sets of 30 yards for anybody wondering. And then a deload week, which is part of the accumulation phase. But if we're going to an intensification or a power phase I only use for my advanced athletes, so let's just say an intensification phase with it as the actual focus. This is 55%, 6x20, 57.5%, 5x20, 60%, 6x15. This would probably be somebody newer, probably like 2 years into training, if I was actually using this exact model, because we're still not at optimal loads. If I'm introducing it back into somebody's training program for like maybe this is the second year they've used sleds, third year they've used sleds, so on and so on, we'd probably start somewhere like 70% to 75%. It also depends if you're an elastic or a power athlete. If you're an elastic athlete, I like to use sleds to develop some strength, but the more advanced you are, the less you're really going to need that. And we can also find other ways to get it through different plyometrics. They say it doesn't really help power athletes, but for myself personally, just the ability to apply more force into the ground and teach myself that, have more time to be able to apply that force has really helped my acceleration. I mean, I was running like 1.76, 10-yard dash, something like that, and I got down to like 1.5s. Not just because of sled training, but I did have a lot of sleds in my training because it feels good. I just like doing it after. I feel faster after. I think that's a big part of it. And just getting into that, learning to accelerate, learning to produce that force. But once again, sleds are a huge, huge, huge bonus in any of our training. Everybody should use them at some point if you're trying to get faster. Obviously, you need those prerequisites. You really need to get into what you're doing. You need to understand the basics first, and then program it right. Understand what you're gaining out of this, the nervous system developments that you're getting out of it, and start small. It's always better to start small and build up rather than start too big. You start getting injured, something goes wrong, and now you're setting yourself back way farther than you want to be. So always start smaller, and then you'll start getting these gains from resisted sprints way before you expect it. It's a great training method. Personally, for my own training, probably my favorite. There is no best training method. Nobody should have a favorite training method. Everybody's a little bit different. Everything's just a tool to use for your training. But I just love resisted sprints. I'm glad this is my first video. I'm talking about resisted sprints, and I'm excited to see what you guys think. If you stay to watch till the end, thank you. I'm impressed that anybody watched me talk for this long. But leave a like down below, subscribe, and let me know anything you would like to see me talk about on these whiteboard talks. And thanks for watching.